So this is Dan Whitman, and this is our very informal Wednesday session on Africa. It is October 1st, 2024. Really honored to have Chris Fomunyoh. I don't want to be hyperbolic, Chris, but I want everybody to know if Cameroon had had the opportunity to have Chris Fomunyoh as president some years ago, Cameroon would be in much better position today than it was. That's a deeply editorial comment, but I really feel that. And I don't know how possible or close it could have been, but you were very brave to make yourself available to your country. Now, we have the benefit of having you in the US working with NDI. You may have something planned, but at some point, could you explain to us NDI, IRI, SEPA, and NED? Because I think people on the call may have heard of these entities, but they may not quite understand where they came from and what they do. And what they do, I should say, so harmoniously together. The International Republic Institute and the National Democratic Institute. If our parties in the United States could work as positively together as those two do, we'd be in much better shape. Chris, can you give us some background to these four organizations?
Sure. First of all, Dan, thank you so much. Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's truly a pleasure to join this group of very distinguished ladies and gentlemen in this conversation. Dan has done so much for our continent that every time he makes a request, I try to comply and try to give back because he's given a lot, not just now, but early on in his career to the continent.
Thank you.
As Dan said, I work for the National Democratic Institute. I've been with NDI for over 2 decades, and it's been a learning experience every day. I remember yesterday was the celebration of the 100th anniversary of President Jimmy Carter. I remember my first, one of my first assignments was staffing President Carter as a former president, obviously, when he went to Togo to monitor the elections, the transitional elections in Togo, when General Eyadema was still in power. So that says something about how long I've been with the organization. NDI was created in 1983 because in 1983, in the early 80s, there was a consensus that developed within Washington that democracy support and democracy strengthening was so important that it needed to be supported on a non-partisan basis, to say that irrespective of the administration of the day, democracy support was something that required non-partisan engagement. And that it was important to take it out of the realm of the strict bilateral foreign policy of the administration of the day. And some of you may remember in the early 80s, the Republicans controlled the White House. Reagan was president. The Democrats controlled Congress. We had Speaker Tip O'Neill, and after him, Speaker Jim Wright. And so the two branches of government came together and decided to form or to create, by a congressional act, the National Endowment for Democracy. And the National Endowment for Democracy was then given the authorization to be that entity that would support democracy-related programs around the globe. And this was at a time, you may remember, when there were already cracks in the Cold War system. There were demonstrations in Poland with the Solidarity movement and Lech Walesa, with the shipyard demonstrations in Kadans. There were changes happening in Latin America, and some of the pro-Soviet regions were collapsing. And in Africa, there was also movement in terms of Namibia fighting for its independence and the whole anti-apartheid struggle. So there were already areas around the globe that required some level of support. And the creation of the National Endowment then took that support out of the realm of the executive branch's approach to foreign policy. And it was agreed that the National Endowment for Democracy should be the conduit through which Congress can make resources available to 4 entities that would develop expertise in their respective areas and use that expertise to support corresponding organizations overseas. And so the 2 main parties then created the 2 party institutes, which were seen as party institutes that would focus on political party strengthening and civil society. And the labor movement created the Solidarity Center, and the private sector created the Center for Private Enterprise, SIPE. And so you have these 4 institutes that represent the whole breadth of the American society or spectrum, being seen as core grantees of the National Endowment for Democracy. That's how we came into existence in 1983. We and none of the 4 organizations gets involved in US domestic politics because we get funding from Congress. So there's a firewall that protects us or requires that we don't get involved in domestic politics. And at the same time protects us from any intervention by the government of the day. So we're not out there trying to implement US policy. We're not out there trying to preach the doctrine of one of the political parties or the other. We're out to work with partners in countries that are in transitions or where there's a need for democratic governance. Our work is done on a nonpartisan basis. In fact, in many countries, we work with all of the political parties that are engaged in the process because a lot of our focus is really about process. And if you bear in mind the fact that in the late 80s, with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, many countries were then making those transitions towards democratic governance. You can understand why the creation of these 4 organizations under the umbrella of the National Endowment for Democracy was so timely, and how much it's happened that in the past 3 or 4 decades, we've been quite impactful, not just in Africa, but in other continents around the globe. So in a nutshell, that's who we are. And we're a nonprofit organization, non-governmental organization. And we work to strengthen and support democracy worldwide. Over to you, Dan. You're muted.
Thank you, Chris. Don't know how that happened. Non-governmental, nonpartisan government-funded organization. I think some of the listeners may find that an odd concept, and they may even be skeptical. For example, Voice of America is an independent news organization funded by the US government. And we find all the time in autocratic governments, they say, no, the government funds you, therefore you are the voice of the government. This is a concept, I don't know of even BBC is partly private, and so has evidently a real independence. Many people express skepticism. How can you be funded by the government but be independent? Well, it's true. It really is. Let me, Chris mentions the late 80s. I think we should mention Larry Diamond, perhaps. Larry Diamond from Stanford, the Hoover Institute, created a thing called the Journal of Democracy. And he was, until he retired a couple of years ago, he was one of the main voices in the world on tracking the rise and fall of democratic movements. And quoting his professor, Samuel Huntington, he talked about something called the third wave of democracies, which created some very good feelings in the 1990s. This had to do, I think, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the readjustment, the positive readjustment. The Cold War was basically finished. The Soviet Union was down. There's a direct correlation between the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of apartheid in South Africa. We can get into that later. But there was a sense of euphoria in the 1990s. Recently, I heard Larry Diamond very disillusioned, very angry, because what looked so good in the 1990s, we have this thing called democratic backsliding. So NDI becomes all the more important. Sorry, Chris, for this digression. I wanted to explain, in nonpartisan, independent government funded, it's an odd concept, but it works in the US. Plus, the importance of the dates you mentioned, 1983, just in time for the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Things looked very good in the 1990s. Now they don't look so good. So what does NDI do that can address this, Chris?
Yes, I agree with your assessment of where things are today and how good they looked back in the day. And I remember several conversations with Larry Diamond and the enthusiasm that we all experienced in the early 90s. And in fact, at the time, we had an in-house joke at NDI because we had just gone through a phase where Namibia obtained its independence in 1989. Nelson Mandela, apartheid began to collapse and began to be dismantled in 91, 92. Nelson Mandela was released. South Africa went through a beautiful elections. And by 1994, Nelson Mandela was the president of a democratic, free South Africa. I counted, I did an inventory between 1991 and 1994, 17 former military regimes on the continent had collapsed or had been chased out of office. I remember that in 1990, when Freedom House did its ratings of democratic countries around the globe, we had only 4 countries in Africa. We had only 4 countries that were considered either free or partially free, or 4 countries that had adopted political pluralism, where there was even a semblance of multi-party politics. And those countries were Senegal, the Gambia, Botswana, and Mauritius. The rest of the continent was either under one-party states, one-party regimes, or military regimes. And so by the end of the 90s, all of that had changed. And the picture was beginning to look very rosy. And so we even had an in-house joke. We said, in 2-3 years, democracy would be well consolidated around the globe. We'll all pack our bags and go look for other things to do. And I think the democracy community at large, globally, became a little complacent. And I think there was a sense that, okay, that first generation of newly elected leaders after the third wave would govern justly. They would govern so well, and democracy would remain so attractive that some of the negative forces, for example, on professional militaries that in the past had staged coups in the 70s and the 80s, now understood the proper role for the military and for security services in various countries, that civil society, which are now emerged in this whole third wave, will become so resolute and so solid in safeguarding the democratic space in different countries that there will be no setbacks. And I think, unfortunately, that complacency then could only take us that far. And in the last 10 years, I would say in the last 10 years, we've really seen a lot of backsliding. And the backsliding is also happening globally, because globally we've seen the reemergence of authoritarian regimes, leaders who feel like only they can fix the problem. We've seen leaders who don't even want to work with political parties, who've dismantled political parties. And we've seen the emergence, and we're still seeing that even in all established democracies in Western Europe, for example, the emergence of far-right movements that are quite close to being very autocratic. And for our continent, this impact is being felt in many ways. We're back to strong men and strong regimes that shrink political space. We're back to military coups, something that we thought was behind us, and those coups being greeted or embraced by the younger generation of Africans, many of whom were not of age when we went through the transitions of the late 80s and early 90s. And I think we're now in a phase where NDI and our partners in various countries and civil society in various countries is trying to fight back, first to stop the bleeding, and then to build democratic institutions back up. And unfortunately, that fight is not being facilitated by the challenges that many countries face internally, whether they're economic hardships that don't create employment opportunities, whether it's disinformation and lack of information integrity, which is bombarding a lot of populations with information that undermines democratic practices and values, whether it's conflict in countries such as Sudan and the Sahel, whether it's generalized insecurity that's making it very difficult for governments to allocate resources in ways that can strengthen emerging and nascent democratic institutions. And so the bottom line of all of that is that when you do opinion polls or the sampling of public opinions across Africa, show that 70% of Africans embrace democracy, value democracy, aspire to live in democratic societies. But at the same time, almost 50% or a slight majority of Africans are displeased or unhappy with the supply side in terms of the functioning of democracy in their respective countries, which means that there's really a lot of work to do for Democrats around the continent and partner organizations such as NDI, IRI, and others.
So we want to quickly get into, Chris, what do you do every day to further democracy? Let me mention also, you quote opinion polls. I think this comes from Afrobarometer. If anybody is not familiar with that, it's the best survey that we have. It originated with an individual in Ghana. Let me underscore this, the statistics Chris just mentioned. 70% want democracy. Slightly more than 50% are unhappy with the state of democracy today. So the challenges are very stark and very clear. And I know that everyone on this call is going to do things in the future, maybe now, to see if we can reverse the reversal. And that's what NDI does. So tell us a bit, well, two things for you, and you can get into any of this that you want, Chris. You gave a talk once at GW you mentioned three things that go in Africa's favor and three challenges. If you can allude to that more urgently, what is NDI doing and how do they interact with IRI in the field?
Well, NDI and IRI really work collaboratively together because of our affiliation with the National Endowment for Democracy. You'll find that there are countries in which we're conducting activities that are very complementary. For example, we generally do respond to requests that come from democratic institutions in the countries in which we work. For example, civil society that may require capacity building support, or newly elected members of parliament that may want some legislative training on how to pass legislation, how to pass bills, how to draft legislation, how to conduct parliamentary debates, parliamentary oversight, the executive branch. We respond to those requests that come that are homegrown, so to speak. And you may find in a big country like Nigeria that IRI is working with one sector and NDI is working with another sector, but we tend to compare notes and share experiences and lessons learned. You may find that during international election observation missions, which is some of the things that we do to provide, to kind of watch and report accurately on electoral processes. We all recognize the importance of elections in democratic societies. Even though we do recognize that elections alone do not a democracy make, they are still an important pillar in the democratic process. And so on elections, for example, we would, in some countries, support citizen observers. Citizens who want to monitor and report on their own elections may require training in the monitoring methodology and help with putting in place systems that allow them to collect their own data and their own information and write their own reports about their own elections. It may also require fielding international election observation missions so that you can report accurately and help inform the world about the electoral process in the given country. It's also a way to show solidarity with those that are working for credible and meaningful elections in that country. And also to, by our presence, deter manipulation of the electoral process. And so you may find that in some countries, we do joint delegations where some of the delegates are recruited by IRI and some are recruited by NDI, and we bring them together from diverse countries, diverse continents, and we form one delegation. We go into the country, we spend some time discussing with the stakeholders, hearing from political parties, hearing from the election commission or the election management body, speaking with civil society, speaking with the media, and then deploying these observers across the country in regions, in districts, to observe polling day and report accurately on what they will have seen. And sometimes we do those missions jointly with IRI. Other times we do them separately, but we tend to collaborate because our work is really being done on a non-partisan basis, and it is not done to further espouse or expand the ideologies of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party of the United States. In fact, in our work, the emphasis is on sharing experiences and lessons learned, recognizing that each country has got its specificities and its challenges, but putting forward the experiences that other countries have gone through and allowing the stakeholders in each of those countries to benefit from what other countries have gone through so they can avoid the mistakes and they can leverage what is worked and what fits in their own country specific situation. In response to Dan's question about what NDI is doing, I've talked about elections, but I would also like to add a very fascinating program that NDI is working on right now, which has to do with constitutionalism and rule of law, which seeks to address one of the weaknesses that has contributed to the democratic backsliding. The observation that even democratically elected governments don't perform well once in office. And we've actually seen situations where presidents who are democratically elected, once in office, not only underperform, but begin to dismantle some of the instruments that got them into power in the first case. And that is played itself out very significantly or very visibly in the ability of governments to respect the constitutions of their own countries. And you would agree with me that in many of our countries, the constitutions are very well written. They're very inspirational. Mm-hmm. They have very progressive, forward-looking ideas, but it is always in the implementation that we see the weaknesses. And so in a number of countries, for example, we had presidents who were elected under constitutions that allowed for limitations on presidential terms, that stipulated that a president could not serve more than 2 5-year terms. But we also saw that once some presidents got in office, they amended those provisions of the Constitution, or they waited until their last year in office to then say, oh, this country needs a new constitution because the other constitution under which I've served for 9 years wasn't working. And so we have to rewrite a new constitution and we have to start the clock from scratch. And that's been most unfortunate. So we designed this program in partnership with 3 African organizations. Mm-hmm. One is the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers that's very active and works out of Nairobi, has branches in South Africa, and that's a grouping of African constitutional lawyers who have also been studying and writing on this issue of constitutionalism. And so they are the brain power, the brain force behind this initiative. At the same time, we also identified civil society organizations that are on the activist track. And so we have AfricTVs, which is a grouping of African civil society organizations that advocate for presidential term limits, and they are now partners in this initiative. So we held a number of conferences on the continent. We held a conference some years ago in Niger Republic when Niger was still an open democratic country. We held a conference most recently in August 2023 in Botswana, August 2022 in Botswana, a country that has been making regular progress in renewing the mandates of its presidents and making sure that presidents serve not more than 2 terms in office, to reinforce the principle that this is one value that strengthens democratic governance on the continent. And as we speak, we're thinking of a 3rd conference in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal, mm-hmm. at which we will bring together all the partners, African partners that have been working on this initiative to kind of share best practices and share recommendations that governments could work with to strengthen governance and constitutional processes in their respective countries, and also discuss new challenges that have emerged and how African civil society organizations and African Democrats as a whole can continue to make sure that governments respect their own constitutions. Because if you don't respect the constitution, then everything else pales in comparison. But a government that respects its constitution has a legal framework that is known, that provides guidance for how citizens engage with the state, and puts guardrails on how elected officials perform once they're in office. And I'm very excited about that as one of our key programs at this point in time.
So, Chris, you've already inspired the group. Mawisa Luchulumanco asks, how can we get involved? That was the question I was going to ask later. Mwende Mbinda seconds that question. We can get into it later if you want, Chris, but is there any way that African scholars and politically engaged individuals can help in this process? Maybe we should go straight to that. I have some other observations and questions, but you've already inspired the interest of this group. Several of them would like to get involved in what you're doing. How would they do that?
Thank you. Thank you. And Dan has my email information, and he can share it with the whole group. And that way I can take the time to respond to specific interests that you may manifest even after our conversation. As I love to say, NDI relies on experts from the home countries in which we work, from the continent itself. And I'm really very proud of the diversity that we have within our organization. As we speak, NDI has got 17 country offices in Africa. And the bulk of our country directors, our country representatives are Africans who know the country, know the continent, know the regions in which they work. That our delegations, when we constitute delegations, whether they're on assessment missions to a country or election observation delegations, we always make sure that we have expertise from the regions, from the continents who know and have studied and written on a lot of these issues. So I'm sure that now that the COVID pandemic is behind us and we're all kind of graduating from that period when we were all in isolation and teleworking, and in fact we stopped a lot of the international election observation missions because it was not appropriate to aggregate people in mass groupings, and international travel was not really advisable. I'm hoping that as we regain our activities, that we can draw and benefit from the expertise that you already have. And that, for me, is one of the advantages, one of the assets, one of the opportunities that Dan alluded to, which I always refer in my presentations to say that Africa of today has tremendous resources, that we should be leading the charge with regards to helping consolidate democracy on our continent, because we know firsthand what the issues are, but we also have a global perspective on what is worked elsewhere and what could be adaptable to work in our countries to help strengthen and consolidate democratic practices and principles.
Thank you. And I have other questions, but I'll leave them for later. Chris, look at the chat from Baudouin Kabeya, who I think is in Kinshasa today. Chris has clearly shown the problem that African presidents do not like to implement the constitutions that are really written well. But what is NDI doing in order to get African presidents to clear up this bad behavior? I'll add an anecdote to that. When I was public affairs officer in Yaoundé, I worked with a youth group that wanted to promote democracy. They wanted to have discussions, and I thought, we all agree that democracy is good. Give me something more than that. And we came up with the very modest contribution. I had a few, maybe $2,000 available, and I printed the Cameroonian constitution, because Cameroonians have never seen their own constitution. And we discovered that in most palais de justice, in most courtrooms, even the judge did not have a copy available. The Constitution, for many people, I'm afraid, is an abstraction. And but what would you say to? I don't know if you can see Baudouin's chat. I have things to bring up, but this is very important. How can NDI persuade presidents to behave better. It's not easy, is it?
Yeah, in fact, yes, thanks for the question. I haven't seen the chat yet, but I think Dan is summarized it well. I will take a look at it. Dan also put his finger on the pulse, and I think there's two ways to deal with this. There's the demand side and the supply side. The demand side is that we have to create the demand for better performance amongst the citizenry, amongst the citizens of the given country. Because it would be very awkward for NDI to come into a country and wag its finger at the head of state who has been elected by his fellow citizens. But on the other hand, the citizens have the right, the constitutional right, in fact, the responsibility to hold their elected leaders accountable. And so working with civil society to create awareness amongst the citizens would allow the citizens to then hold their elected leaders accountable. And so that the demand for the respect of the Constitution should come from the citizens themselves, who can then partner with other organizations that are also working on the same issue. And we have seen results in countries where citizens have been able to mobilize. For example, in Benin Republic, the citizens of Benin formed a whole movement which was called Ne touche pas à ma constitution.
Ah, wonderful.
Yes, ne touche pas à ma constitution. Don't touch my constitution. At the time when they thought President Kerekou at the time was thinking about extending his term, and then after him, Boni Yayi was also thinking, that movement was a citizens, grassroots movement by citizens. That's it, ne touche pas à ma constitution.
Beautiful.
And it became extremely popular that everyone understood what the stakes were. And because the groundswell of support for that movement was so strong, it made it difficult for the leaders to want to attempt to amend the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So that mobilization needs to happen, and that's why I'm very excited about this program that we're implementing with African Grassroots Movement, because increasingly, the question of presidential term limits is no longer a taboo subject. Mm-hmm. It used to be that citizens couldn't talk about it, but now increasingly, as citizens are becoming aware of their rights under their own constitutions, they're speaking up and holding their elected leaders accountable. Mm-hmm. The other thing that once that demand side is in progress, the other thing that we can do, it makes it easier for partners to be able to raise the topic. I remember going back to the 90s again, when one of the leaders of Malawi, Dr. Banda, was a life president, and it was written in the Constitution of Malawi that the president will be president for life. And at the time of that third wave of democratization, he was coming under pressure to also open political space in Malawi. And he said, no, my people are not asking for that. And so why are you all asking me to open? They love me. And when I go on presidential visits, they all come out and they dance for the president. Yeah. And we said, but Mr. President, why don't you ask your people in a referendum? And let's hear what they think in a public, well-organized referendum. And of course, when he did the referendum, 67% of Malawians said they wanted presidential term limits and they wanted political pluralism. And that's when Malawi made its transition. So you have to create that demand side, and then you can work with the leaders to convince them that they should listen to their people's voices. And in fact, in the early 2000s, 2005 to be precise, NDI brought together under what we call the African Statesmen's Initiative, It was the first time on the African continent that a non-governmental, non-profit organization convened a high-powered meeting, a high-level meeting of African leaders. We assembled in Bamako, Mali, 17 former African heads of states who had been very instrumental in the democratic transitions in their respective countries. Presidents such as Jerry Rawlings of Ghana, Joaquim Chissano of Mozambique, President Soglo of Benin Republic. We had 17 of them. Even Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia made the trip to Bamako. And the topic of discussion for the 3-4 days that we had together was, what is the state of democracy in Africa in 2005? Why have political transitions worked in your countries? And how can former heads of states also contribute to the consolidation of democracy in Africa? And one of the offsprings of those conversations with those former presidents was their commitment to continue to play constructive roles to help consolidate democracies in the countries that were in transition. A lot of those former presidents, after the Bamako meeting, launched their own foundations, became very involved in election monitoring missions, became very involved in political mediation when countries were in conflict, and even in humanitarian causes in countries that were under stress. And those kinds of mechanisms, as informal as they can be, can also be very persuasive, so that if there's a sense that a president in Mozambique or in Namibia needs some talking to in advance, that we can help facilitate bringing 3 or 4 former African presidents to travel to that country and sit down with the current president and talk to him as a peer and convince that president on the need for respecting the constitution of the country. And I have some stories that I can share at some point about how some of those conversations have happened.
This is great. I challenge the Kenyan participants and the DRC participants in this conversation to do exactly that. You might be surprised at how much influence you can have as a civil society acting responsibly. You know, you mentioned President Banda, Chris, who we think from the 60s and 70s, it's an interesting period. We had some terrible leaders at that time. We think of Banda as a dictator. In fact, he was a very disciplined, very conservative person. He was a believer in Christianity, and he was a very strict person. However, he believed in his country, and that kind of sets him apart from some of the other early leaders. When somebody suggested to him, listen to your people, Joseph Kabila would not have done that. I can think of other leaders who would say nonsense. Chris also mentions Benin, which is my favorite example of how in Africa, something can change overnight. It's amazing. Benin, tiny Benin, was ruled by a very vicious dictatorship. I guess they considered themselves Marxists, something like North Korea. And I remember if you received a phone call from anybody on your landline in those days, you had to say, "Prête à la révolution." And if you didn't say that, you went to jail. I mean, this was a terrible dictatorship. Then there was an election, and the military leader conceded defeat. And the next day, Benin was democratic. I think it's a wonderful example of how to avoid discouragement and pessimism. These things can happen unexpectedly in both directions, of course. Abisagi Boyani, our leader, in Nairobi has a comment. Abisage, can you unmute yourself? Let's see. Can I help you with that? Abisage. Yes, you are unmuted. Abisage, who Chris actually organized 25 Kenyans to be part of this group. Abisage, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your continuous acknowledgement. And I want to reiterate what we've had today and actually just concur that it's an example here in Kenya ever since we had our post-election violence in 2007.
Yeah.
Term we go into every electioning year, it is very tense. The situation is tense. And usually we have a 49-51 almost all the time. And we've always, it's about 2-3 times, we are always, almost, we move from the urban centers to the countryside where you're going to be with your families in case we go back to what happened, because it is tension. But now we see mediation comes in when when we have a political lead, it went the other way around. Like recently we had President Ruto versus Raila Odinga. And I know there were background talks from their peers, and this helps a lot. It has continued a lot, and we move on slightly. We see changes, and for the sake of peace in our country, we see the changes, and it's a good initiative to have their peers, their former other current presidents, meeting them, meetings, for and move on. So it's a good initiative, and I concur and agree that it will take us fast, slowly, a step a day at a time. We will have elections that are, we will say what elections that are not flawed rather.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Abisage. And again, I don't want to be too silly and optimistic, but I would say if citizens are so passionately involved in elections that they commit violence, this does indicate that they believe in democracy. I mean, that's a kind of perverse way to think of it. It doesn't make me happy that there's violence. I remember the violence in 2007. But it does indicate that the citizens are involved in a bad way in that case, but they're involved. Chris, what do you say to that? What do we do? We know that every time there's an election in Kenya, there is tension. And we're not quite sure about President Ruto. We're not ready to judge him yet. There's some pros and some cons. How do you address Abisage's point about disturbance and tension and violence? It is a bad thing, of course, but does it indicate an increasing interest in democracy?
Yeah, thanks, Abisage, for your comments and for sharing with us additional details on the Kenya experience. Before I come to the Kenya experience, let me just comment on the point Dan made with regards to Benin Republic. In fact, picking up that phone call, the greeting every morning was revolution or death, la révolution ou la mort, on the Keriku.
Yes. And the next day it changed in one day.
And the next day it changed dramatically. And that small Benin, what happened in Benin in 1991 around the National Conference impacted all of Francophone Africa, because Benin was the one country that introduced the concept of a national conference. Mm-hmm. And before we knew, countries were calling national conferences one after the other, during which there were public debates, civil society representation, farmers, teachers, professionals. It was like an open display of democracy at work, where citizens came together to rewrite the rules of engagement including redrafting new constitutions for their countries. And so that's also one example where you can say no country is small or no country is big, because we've seen instances where small countries have impacted developments in even bigger countries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the example of Kenya, and I agree completely with what Adesege just said in terms of the incremental progress that we've seen since the very unfortunate, deadly post-election conflict in Kenya in 2007, 2008. And we saw the peer interventions, we saw the mediation, we saw the efforts at creating a government of national unity as one way to mitigate the sharp political cleavages amongst the competitors. And interestingly, after the Kenya experience, Zimbabwe drew some lessons from the Kenya experience.
Mm-hmm.
And when they also faced a situation with post-election contention, contestation, and violence, they also adopted the approach of a government of national unity. Unfortunately, the concept of the government of national unity hasn't really worked that well, but in the immediate to short term, it mitigated the violence and the extreme polarization that had almost torn Kenya apart. What we've seen in the incremental reforms that have taken place in Kenya around the electoral process, the decentralization process, where now we have more counties and governors of counties are elected, that is taking democracy closer to the people. And I think that that is going to help diffuse some of the tensions. And that's also going to help put an end to the concept of winner take all, because the over-centralization of political power at the center in many of our countries on the continent means that whoever wins the center has everything. And in that dilemma of winning everything or losing everything, it becomes an existential threat, and the stakes become extremely high. But when you diffuse power, as is now the case in Kenya, you see that even the ruling party that won at the national level didn't win all the governorships. And the opposition party that lost at the national level still has the opportunity to govern some of the counties because their candidates won some of the counties. And so there's not this winner-take-all mindset that in many African countries stokes violence, because people then feel, if I lose this, I am frozen out of the political process for another 5 years or maybe forever.
Yeah.
The Kenya example also highlights a point that I would like us to kind of conclude with, which is that many African countries have actually made progress in terms of democratic governance. Where we seem the challenge is in our inability to consolidate what we've already accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
If we could consolidate that and hold to that, then we could always build up on what is being accomplished to make sure that the next elections are freer and are violent, less violent than the previous ones, that the next governments are better off than the past governments. And if we can consolidate that and continue to build up, then we would also be, guaranteeing for future generations that they wouldn't have to fight the battles that we're already fighting right now.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge that we see in countries like in the Sahel or in the Horn of Africa is that some of our countries take 2 steps forward and then 3 steps backwards.
Yep.
And then they have to restart. Because I can almost guarantee that in the countries that are going through conflict, in the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to go through some transitions again, and they're going to start building up. And so we, as African scholars, African opinion leaders, have to make that effort to find a way to consolidate the gains, because as late President John F. Kennedy said, democracy is a never-ending endeavor. The beauty of democratic governance is in knowing, internalizing the concept that we always have to do better. We have to continue to harness and protect it on a daily basis, because that's the process that would allow us to consolidate our gains while opening up additional spaces to make sure that our fellow citizens can see an improvement in their well-being and can get the dividends, the benefits of democracy, which our people so desperately require or desire.
And this all comes from civil society, right, Chris? That's the origin of it. I beg the participants in Nairobi, if you can fix this winner-take-all situation, could you please come to the United States and help us fix that? Because we have a problem with winner-take-all, and I don't know if you've followed this, but the presidential election here could be determined in a single small city, Omaha, Nebraska. I explained. Nebraska, which is largely a Republican state traditionally, and which has a Republican governor, has not had winner take all. They have been able to proportion, which I think is, we call it democracy, I think. This is what Chris is arguing for. The question came up recently. The Republican Party is concerned because the city of Omaha is likely to be a Democratic majority. The rest of the state is likely to be a Republican majority. So Republicans have said, let's make it winner take all. The Republican governor of Nebraska said no. He said, we can discuss this at a future time, but the time is not now. Keep an eye on the US elections. It's crazy, it's grotesque, but it could be determined by a single small city named Omaha. Government of national unity, a universal concept. I don't know if Africans think of this as a Eurocentric or US-centric notion, but as Chris has said, it's not ideal. It's certainly better than civil war. I think everybody here, I think, understands government of national unity is meant as a temporary measure to bring opposing parties together for a temporary period so that they can survive until a better period. By the way, I put Chris's email on the chat. It's quite simple. It's Chris, last name F, the last initial F, at ndi.org. It's pretty simple. You'll see it in the chat. There's a big paradox here, Chris, in democracy in Africa. I think you've reminded us that 70% of Africans favor democracy. At a village level, and I don't want to generalize, I know that Africa is vastly diverse, but traditionally, at a village level, the political organization is done by something called consensus. And even enlightened and wonderful leaders like Julius Nyerere in the 70s were saying, what do you mean democracy? Do you want to create a phony, artificial opposition? We Africans, our culture is conducted through consensus. So I don't understand why we should be in favor of opposition parties. Chris, how do you respond to that genuine and compassionate observation of a great leader, Julius Nyerere, who was opposed to political diversity?
Yes, I can see why at the time, just coming out of the pro-independence movement or the struggle for independence, there was some reluctance to admit opposition parties. But I think also that we have to approach the issue differently. We have to approach the issue from a baseline that says that our communities are very diverse, right from the family home, right in your immediate family. you can see the diversity of men, women. You can see diverse viewpoints from the younger generation, from the elderly. Diversity exists in every society.
Mhm.
And so you go from the family cell to the village level, to the district, to the country, and you can see the diversity that exists within the country. Even a country that on the surface may look monolithic, once you start dissecting below the surface, you can see how that diversity exists even in that society. And so the question is, how do you, in this day and age, when every sector of society wants voice, how do you create a mechanism by which those diverse voices could all be heard, so they all feel they have a seat at the table, so they all feel they have a stake in the well-being of the country, they have a stake in the game, and how can you channel those diverse views in a way that makes for coherent conversations that can impact policy or can be transformed into policy decisions that then impact positively on the livelihood of citizens. If you approach the conversation from that perspective, then you would see political parties as a necessary mechanism to do just that.
Mhm.
Because by sweeping dissent under the rug, you're not going to do away with it. It's not because a leader assumes that, oh, we all think alike, that we all think alike. There's nothing like that. You're probably just sweeping it under the rug. And what happens is that at some point in time, that segment of the population would feel that it's been suppressed, that it doesn't have avenues to express its views, and therefore would find other ways to have those views heard, which then leads people to look for violent alternatives to genuine citizen engagement and participation. That would be my response. And I'm sure that in today's Tanzania, you can see the diversity between people on mainland Tanzania and people in Zanzibar. You can see the diversity along religious lines. You can see the diversities amongst coastal communities versus communities in the hinterland. And so the question for the leader should be, how do I harness this rich diversity and create a tapestry which is not monocolor, but which captures that diversity so that every Tanzanian can see themselves in the national tapestry that I will put forward. And that's how you get citizens to belong and to become active and constructive citizens rather than feeling disaffected, excluded, and therefore depressed and finding other alternatives to get their voice heard.
Chris has just given us the bright view of the future of Africa. This is quite a wonderful observation, Chris. If we knowing that there is diversity, sometimes invisible, sometimes repressed, just understanding that people do have opinions, that civil society, I believe, I don't know, I can't prove it. I believe in North Korea, there exists a civil society. They exist everywhere. This is what makes the work of NDI fun, I believe. Yvonne Ndanu, your comment. Thank you for
Yes.
coming in. Very good, thank you. You can unmute your video if you want to. That's up to you. Okay. There you
am I
are.
visible? Oh, okay. Good evening from Nairobi. I like the comments by our speaker where he said political parties are the solution, and how do we harness the rich diversity? That has gotten me thinking. Let's say in Kenya, we've seen the Generation Z movement. Now, in your views, how would you advise our politicians even the president, to handle the Gen Z movement, because they are giving key issues. They are frustrated in their own way, but they also feel the government is not listening to them. They have accused each other within this space of being bought over. So how, as a country, would you advise the political class to look at these young men and women who want their voices heard and their opinions heard? I think that is my question.
Yvonne, thank you so much. And recalling Keith Richburg, do you have everybody remember Keith Richburg last week or the week before? His article published in September, I think, was what got my attention, what made me realize you must meet this guy. His article, his op-ed, I forget the date, 2 months ago, said that the United States and other observers and international community, they talk to the elites. They're missing the point. They should talk to the people in the streets. That's Gen Z, Gen X, as Yvonne reminds us. I think I'm so glad that a significant journalistic voice recognized this. I don't know if even American policymakers understand the future is in the people in the streets. It's not in those who are in power, because they won't be there forever. Chris, can you respond to this marvelous observation?
Yes, thank you so much, Yvonne, for raising the youth question, because truly speaking, that's the future of Africa. Africa is the youngest continent on the surface of the earth right now. The demographics are really in favor of the youth. And it's been projected that in the next 20, 30 years, by 2050, Africa will be 25% of the world's population. So 1 in 4 human beings will be African. And in that 25%, the bulk of it is young people. And we and our leaders better pay attention. And so you have this dichotomy where in some literature, the youth bulge is considered as a threat. And in some, which I had the second category, it's considered as an opportunity. And I think that the continent, through its youth, has an opportunity to really shape the future of the world if we treat our young people and the younger generation well. The dilemma that we face, and Yvonne also alluded to this, is that we see across the continent a lot of youth disaffection with the functioning of political parties. The youth, today's youth, are very different from the youth of the 60s. Today's youth, they were not part of the colonial process, so they have no complex. They're also well educated. They're also well linked into the networks of international communications through social media. A lot of them get their news from sources that are not under state control. And so they're very independent thinkers. And building on my first observation earlier about the fact that dissent and diverse viewpoints do exist, my recommendation to our governments would be to meet the young generation, the Generation Zs of Kenya and other countries where they are. Meet them in their space. Don't wait for them to come to you at State House. Because, for example, on political parties, when you talk with the young people, they have brilliant ideas about how political parties could formulate policies on various social, educational, political, financial issues. They have brilliant ideas, but they feel there's no way for them to get those ideas into how the political parties formulate their policies. Because the political parties haven't integrated this youthful population and the space in which this youthful population conducts its business. Political parties have not integrated that into how they organize themselves. And so you go into many political parties and the youth leader or the leader of the youth wing of the political party is someone in his 50s or 60s.
Oh, we lost
That
a few
individual
seconds.
cannot relate with the youth, the Generation Z in their 20s and 30s. So political parties need to do better at creating platforms that can be attractive to these young people. They need to entrust them with responsibilities that can have them have a say in how their lives are run by the state. And the state needs to create listening opportunities for them to have formal engagements with the young, with the younger generation.
I don't know how much time you have, Chris. We have two fantastic comments on the chat. We'll keep going as long as you can.
If we can wrap up in, it's already
It's 11:20. Let me try to summarize two wonderful chat comments, and if you have time, let's see. Actually, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Madagascar says the next generation has a massive role to play in shaping the future. We need to invest there, especially in youth bulge. Human rights research, we're seeing more the intersection of good governance and FORB. I don't know what that is. Maybe you do, Chris. But that's from the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Madagascar. In addition, Mawisa Luchulumanko asks about South Africa. Another challenge, because South Africa looked pretty good in 1994 and in 2000. However, let me try to read this. It's the longest comment. Let's see. Are democratic states able to move from multi-party states to singular party states and remain democratic? Is there such a thing? And the question becomes, because of recent developments in South Africa, where parties have emerged to gain seats in National Party, but have not been or are not projected to have electoral conferences. And to add, South Africa is currently run by a government of national unity, for lack of a better terminology. There's no formal GNU in South Africa, but the recent election gave pretty confused results. So can a country go to a single party state and remain democratic? That's one question. And the whole topic of South Africa, a huge topic. The I don't want to say confusion, the complexity of the results of the recent election raised some questions. South Africa does not, the ANC has lost the stature that it had before. So this creates both an opening and a challenge. Maybe you'd like to conclude by taking one of those comments, Chris?
Sure. I think the comment from Madagascar with regards to FORB, that probably would be freedom of information. Is it access to public information, which is something that can also enrich political discourse in a number of countries for civil society and media experts? Maybe that's the question that was being brought forward. But I would say also that South Africa, the recent developments in South Africa provide a real learning opportunity that are very relevant to the conversation we've just had. You can trace a number of points that were highlighted to what just happened in South Africa. The role of the youth. The South African youth of today wasn't active in the anti-apartheid movement. They were born after apartheid had collapsed. And so their frame of reference is different. And they want results. They are zeroing in on the supply side of good governance and democracy. And so that captures where the African youth is today. They want results of their governance. And for the ANC and other historical parties that for years have run elections solely on the work that they did in the pre-independence or pre-democratic South Africa, are being served notice that those arguments alone will no longer suffice. And it's going to be very important, coming out of the South African experience, to follow very closely what happens in Mozambique, when Mozambique has its elections in a few weeks' time, whether Frelimo, as the dominant party that fought for independence, would have the same stronghold on the electorate as they used to have before, or whether this younger generation is asking for results and performance and transparency and holding leaders accountable on issues of corruption and lack of good performance. And that would be valid also for Zimbabwe at some point. ZANU-PF. Are the younger generation still going to march march along the drumbeat of the pro-independence movement, or are they now looking for concrete results? In Namibia with SWAPO, and so, or even in Angola with the MPLA. So we have to keep an eye open and to see whether there will be reverberations of what what recently happened in South Africa, in all of the other countries in the region. And that speaks to the role of the youth. And that it reinforces the fact that we have to pay attention to the younger generation, and we have to meet them in the spaces where they are, listen to them, and factor in their desires and also their views on how the countries could be run. I am not worried about South Africa becoming a one-party state. I don't think that would happen. Although there's not a formal document that says this is a government of national unity, the government was forced into having to rebuild a coalition, a governing coalition, to be able to allow the government to get the support or the approval of parliament to get enough seats of parliamentary support for the government's agenda and policy. In some ways, this would allow the government of South Africa, the newly constituted government of South Africa, to self-correct, which again is another beauty in democratic societies, that when the government is almost going over the edge, a properly conducted election can provide opportunities for self-correction. And I think that in the performance of the newly constituted government of South Africa, because there are now checks and balances even within the executive branch of government, that we're probably going to see better governance than was the case when the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa had a free slate to govern without any contrary views or divergent views, even within the executive branch of government. And that speaks again to the importance of elections and well-conducted elections, because they provide citizens with a unique opportunity to be able to determine or hold their leaders accountable. You can sense where I'm going to end with this in saying that despite the challenges of the day, I remain very optimistic about the continent's future. And that optimism comes multiplied by conversations like this one, where I see African leaders and scholars and opinion leaders and civic leaders that you all are being willing and eager to step forward, already stepping forward, to make sure that we can continue to hold our leaders accountable, because we've got the resources, whether it's natural resources, human capital, to be able to thrive and occupy our seats at the global table. There is no reason why we couldn't do that. And I'm sure that with your continued engagement, we would make sure that our continent is in a better place going forward, and that future generations don't have to fight the battles of the past, but hopefully consolidate what the continent would have earned in the process of putting in place mechanisms and processes that can allow us to better govern ourselves. So I really want to thank you all for making the time for us to have this conversation, and to thank Dan again for giving me this opportunity to rub minds, as my Nigerian brothers would say, with all of you. I wish you well in your future undertakings. Thank you.
Chris Fomunyoh, you have inspired us. You have given us reasons for optimism. Sometimes optimism is challenged in this environment. And we'll call this the October 2nd movement. You have made this day historic for this group. And as you've seen, there's tremendous motivation in this wonderful group. And we really, really thank you. General announcement, I will post on Google Classroom the coming schedule. We have a journalist coming and a think tank person and a scholar in Budapest, Hungary. And we will have the former Assistant Secretary for Africa coming in future weeks. So have a look at Google Classroom. I will post the next 5 or 6 of these. Welcome you to all of this. Chris, can't thank you enough. And as you see, we have energy here that allies to your own. And perhaps we can find concrete and tangible ways of working together. We all need democracy, which is accountability, as you point that out. Thank you, everybody. This has been, for me, it's been inspirational, from both sides. Chris and the group joining us. Thank you, everybody. It's been a great session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.